Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I am your host, Benedikt, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello, Benny. I'm good, man. I'm going for a run right after this. I'm very excited. And I want to ask, how many kilometers have you ran in the last 7 days? Because if people may remember or may not, but Benny is training for an ultra marathon, which is insane.
Yeah,
totally insane.
It is kind of insane. About 65 kilometers.
Whoa.
65,
Man.
66.
I did 6 kilometers yesterday, so I'm going to have to pick it up to catch up here. But
yeah, this was the last 7 days. But yeah, it's cool. It's fun, but it's also challenging, of course.
Yeah, no doubt. Wow. Okay, yeah. People, if you need somebody you can trust to get your mix done, this guy can handle it. Anybody that can run 60 kilometers in 70 days and still show up to podcast is going to be able to finish a mix. They're reliable.
yeah, totally. And I'll do that before my work day or after the work, but usually before that. So no worries. I'm not gonna stop mixing your songs just because I'm running all the time. I get up very early and then I get my running in and then I go to the studio.
Soon you'll be doing it while you run. You'll have a little mobile setup, headphones
that
on, jogging down the road.
Yeah, that would be the dream. No, like the thing is, it actually helps. I don't know about you, but it actually helps me with the studio work too, or with work in general. I think, once it gets past a certain point, it gets exhausting, of course, and then you have to pause for a week or not pause, but slow it down a little bit. And it's an insane training schedule that I follow for this insane race. But running in general, I think, I don't know, I feel fresh and more focused for the most part. I might have to sometimes I have to take a 10-minute nap at noon or something, just because it's exhausting
Body's
to run
tired. Yeah.
in the mornings and you just get tired. But then I get back up fresh again. And overall, I feel a lot more sluggish and tired and exhausted when I don't exercise, honestly. And I don't know. So I really think it helps, actually. And I get more done since I run regularly.
100%. Like it's exhausting for your body, but it actually revitalizes your brain, and mixing is such a mental game. It's like a mental sport. Like by the end of a mixing day, my brain is exhausted, right? So running is like a little refresher for it. It's awesome.
Yeah, totally. I'll keep you posted on this. I'll keep you updated on when the race gets closer. But for now, I just getting these miles in, and we'll see.
Great.
All right. So about today's episode, I guess, right?
Yeah. Let's do it.
So we're going to talk about how to prepare and export MIDI tracks for mixing. So this is something I think we haven't talked about in much detail so far, because most of the time the artists that we work with are bands, rock bands, or even if it's solo artists, it's usually like real instruments most of the time. I think we don't work a lot or at least I don't work at all in the electronic music world. So audio tracks are more important to me usually than MIDI tracks. But still, especially these days, it's not uncommon for people to also deliver MIDI tracks or to deliver MIDI tracks even instead of the real instruments, even in the context of a band. So that might mean people program drums and they delivered the printed version of the drum kit plus the original MIDI. That might mean people have post-production elements in their songs, synths, or whatever, and they deliver both. Sometimes they deliver just the MIDI because they have a hard time choosing things. I don't recommend that. I recommend always including the audio version too, and even if it's just a scratch track. But sometimes it's clear from the beginning that they want to deliver MIDI, and then you have to, somebody has to create a sound from that. That's just the reality these days. And I'm going to get into that and why we don't think that this is actually part of mixing, but it's the reality. We get delivered MIDI files. And what happens often is that those files don't always arrive here in the way they should. So sometimes it's very hard for us to deal with these files for multiple reasons. And if you want to make your own life easier when you mix, and you want to give yourself more quickly available options in the mix without headaches and tedious setup work that you have to do all the time, or if you want to make sure that your mixing engineer, like Malcolm or I, can get the most out of the tracks you deliver, then you need to prepare and export your MIDI tracks correctly. That's why we're making this episode. And the thing is, unfortunately, all the different DAWs out there, they all work differently. And some DAWs make it pretty difficult to export MIDI properly. And it's also, as I said, very different for every DAW. So, I don't know, but at least in my experience, exporting and importing MIDI is often not as straightforward as doing the same thing with audio tracks, which can, and that means it can lead to all kinds of errors in the process. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's why we want to do this episode. You'd think it should be very easy to export and import MIDI tracks, but for some reason they are more. It's much more likely to have errors or like weird mistakes or things missing or confusing things happening with MIDI than it is with audio.
It does seem that way. I think it is just more a more flexible format, so I guess there's more options and that thus more room for error. I did want to quickly add that like one more reason that you want to know how to do this is because I think more and more people are collaborating amongst each other in bands remotely as well now. So you might need to send a MIDI track to a bandmate and, kind of be keeping mirrors of your respective sessions on your own independent computers. And this is, so you're going to have to send MIDI at some point. You might as well learn how to make sure you get it right now. It really is a lot like how we talked about exporting audio tracks for mixing, though. There's a lot of parallels. The core values are the exact same. We want them to all line up with each other. We want to know what they are, so they're labeled correctly, so we can tell what they are. And now remember that when we're talking with audio files and it's not labeled, it's still annoying, even though we can just listen to it and hopefully figure out what it is. But that can be hard on some drum kit stuff, like stuff like that. But if it's a guitar mic, it's going to be like, okay, this is a guitar track, relabel it. But it's, we still want it to be labeled. On a MIDI track, there's no sound at all. It is just MIDI information, right? So like depending on what virtual instrument we load up on that track, it's just going to play whatever we load up. It doesn't matter what you've programmed really. So there's no way for the mixer or whoever you've sent the MIDI to know what instrument's meant to be playing here, right? Like there's just no way at all to understand that. So you have to make sure it's labeled. And that can be actually tricky on your side because if you export it without it being labeled and it just spits into a folder on your computer unlabeled, how do you know which one's which? Right? So You've got to figure that out. And then there's it's all lined up, it is all labeled, and then really the third requirement boils down to that it is finished, and what you've sent is what we're meant to get, so that we know that we can mix it and it's not going to change later. Like, okay, I changed the fill. You don't know that we're going to be able, well, we'll get into that a little bit, but it has to be done essentially.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to get into the details of all of these things, but that's basically I'd say the three most important things here is that, as you said, it's going to make sense when you import it. So it has to line up, it has to be labeled correctly, and it has to be done. That's you summed it up very well there. So before we dive into the details, and I don't think this is going to be a very long episode because there's really only a few things that you got to be aware of, but they are really important. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of people are not really aware of these things because if you don't have to collaborate with other people, you might not know that these things actually happen. You just have your MIDI and your DAW and you work with your, you program drums and you work with your sampler. And so you don't know what actually happens when you export it and then somebody else re-imports it. And if they use a different DAW, it gets even worse and all these things. So you might not be aware of that, but it's super important for you to know those things. And even if you mix yourself, I think you should know that because there are some ways of using MIDI that your mixing workflow would benefit from and that you just don't know about maybe. And it gives you more creative options. It makes your workflow better. So understanding these principles definitely helps. And before we get into it, we can't really explain to you, unfortunately, how to exactly do it in your DAW. I got to say that before we start because every DAW does it differently. So I can tell you click here and then do that and then do this. But if you understand the core principles, it's pretty easy to figure it out in your own DAW. So it's basically always like that with a lot of things in different DAWs, but with MIDI specifically, there's even the basic MIDI capabilities aren't even the same across DAWs. So Logic is a lot better than Pro Tools when it comes to MIDI, or Ableton is probably the best of all, and then everything in between. So we can't really tell what you should do and how exactly it works in your DAW, but we can tell you what we are looking for when people send us MIDI to work with, what the essentials are that always have to be done, basically. And then you can easily figure out how to do that in the DAW because it's not complicated technically. You just have to understand what the expectations are, what the standard is, and why it's important to know these things, right?
So it's this is going to be kind of a read between the lines episode, and you're going to have to we're telling you what we need as mixers receiving files, and you're going to have to figure out how to do it on your side. It's more so like learning to speak the language a little bit and learning what is expected. So you'll see it. When you try and export something, you're going to see some options and be like, oh, okay, I know that. Like I need to click that now because I know what they're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's start with the basic thing that you already explained, and that is understand that MIDI is not audio. So there's no audio information in a MIDI track. The tricky thing is if you import a MIDI track into a DAW, or even if you play it on even on a computer, I think you can have a preview of a MIDI track, and that will play something. So it could lead to you thinking that there is audio information. But what it is that any player or any DAW will just load up some default instrument and play back the MIDI information. But that is not audio that's in the MIDI. It's just some sampler or some virtual instrument that's been triggered by the MIDI. The MIDI itself has nothing in it. That's why the files are so small. It's just kilobytes. It's not even megabytes. It's like very small files most of the time. And that's because there's no audio in there. They are just data that just triggers something. It just tells an instrument, the very basic form of it tells the instrument to play a note and then to stop a note. And that's basically it. And which note to play. So that's the basics. And there's more to it, but that's the basics. And you have to understand that. And I'm saying that because I've had people send me MIDI and they were like, this sounds different than what I have. And they don't understand why. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know what you have because, So these days it doesn't happen anymore because I tell people what to send and all these things. But it happened back in the day and they didn't understand that I couldn't hear what they were hearing because I didn't even know which instrument they were using. They just sent the MIDI. And on my end, it loaded up whatever, and
right.
So understand that MIDI doesn't have any audio information on it. No sound.
Room for miscommunication for sure. And yeah, on that note, if you have a sound that you are committed to, you don't want it to change, then there's no reason to really even send the MIDI. Just send that instrument, render it down, print it as an audio file, send that instead. You can always send both, but send that wet as well so that they have it and let them know that, let your mixer know this synth is pretty much exactly what I'm looking for. Can we use this?
Yes, exactly.
Synth being an example, I should say.
Yeah, totally. The second one is tricky to me because, it has to be done, but it can get a little tedious, especially with like drum kits and different virtual drum kits that are out there these days. There's so many different options. So if you send MIDI and you want the person on the other side, let's say you have a drum kit. Let's say you send the printed version, the audio version of your virtual drum kit, but you also send the MIDI because you're not really sure if your sounds are good. And then both of you, the mixer and you end up deciding that it's maybe the samples are not so good and you want to exchange them for something else. Now, if you want the mixer to be able to do that and to be able to do that quickly and without errors, the mixer has to know which of the MIDI notes in your MIDI track belong to which shell of the drum kit or which symbol. Like what is what? Like what is on that track basically. And the way this works is there's something called a MIDI map. So there's a default configuration with with every virtual drum kit or every virtual instrument where it says with a piano or something like that, it's easy. Like a C is a C and an A is an A. It's notes. With a drum kit, it's like a C. Every MIDI note still has a note, but on a drum kit we don't have these notes. So a C could be a kick drum and a D could be a snare. Right. But if you change the instrument and keep the MIDI track the same, that C could now be a tom or a hi-hat or something else. Because the default configuration, the map, is different. So the notes are the same, but they're triggering a different part of the kit with different instruments. So what you have to do is you have to include the MIDI map or write down a legend or something so that the receiving person knows that a C is a kick and the E is a snare or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, a little clarification on the terminology here. MIDI map is definitely one phrase, but MIDI map gets confusing because MIDI map is often also referring to like the tempo map. Sometimes those get exchanged. You might see it as legend. You might see it as key map. There's kind of all these different phrases for it. And little hack, there's a setting inside of your instrument somewhere that'll show you this data because you can actually change it. You can almost always exchange and make it what you want if you wanted it to be laid out differently. And some have presets for different things to make it match other samplers, whatever. Find that window and then just screenshot it on your computer. Drop that in the folder as well with all your other files that you're sending over. And then there's a little visual guide for whoever's receiving the files to what key is what as a backup. We still want you to label things when possible, but having that key legend there is going to be totally kind of essential.
Yes, totally. And Yeah, it can get a little tedious. I mean, the screenshot idea is actually pretty good. Then you don't have to write down things. But yeah, it's like so many different options these days, and they all have different maps. And so, and if you have very complex drum kits, like if you have a huge Superior drummer kit with, I don't know, 10 cymbals and 5 toms or whatever, and you're making like a crazy complex metal, then yeah, it's likely that something's going to be messed up. And then there are not only the different shells and cymbals, there are different articulations as well. So there might be the same part of the kit might be spread out over 3 different notes, like keys,
Right.
because it's like hi-hat open, hi-hat closed, hi-hat semi-open, or whatever.
Right.
So you have to be very, very clear here and very detailed, because there's no way for us to know that this hi-hat is supposed to be semi-open versus completely open or something like that.
Totally. Yeah, that's a great point. And on that note, sending an audio reference of the track, totally awesome idea. Even sending like wet printed versions of all of the shells is great as well. And then noting in an email, or again on like a text document or something in the folder with all your audio and MIDI files that you're sending over, write down what sampler you were using. So the mixer or their prep assistant could look at, okay, they're using Logic stock kit. I can just quickly Google that and find all the info I need on it. That could be useful as well.
Oh yeah, good idea. Great idea. Totally. All right, then the next thing is the start and end points of the MIDI. That's the same. That's true for audio as well. But with MIDI can be a little tricky. With audio, typically you set some sort of marker, locator, or whatever, and it will export from start to finish. With MIDI, sometimes there will be a little blank space or something in the beginning or the end. It will only export the actual MIDI notes, and it will look weird, but it still will put it in the right spot if done correctly. So it just looks a little different in some DAWs compared to audio. The important thing is, if you import it, will it be lined up with the audio? Will it be in time? Will it have the correct tempo and time signature and all of that? Because those things are typically saved in the MIDI file. So worst case is you exported the audio, everything's great, but I don't know, I've had situations where they didn't record to the click of the DAW, but like the drummer had a click in their ear and they just ignored the time, the click in the DAW. So the project might be to a default 120 or something, but the actual song is 180, or I don't know. And then they export the audio and all is lined up and everything's good, but then they export the MIDI, and the MIDI just, when you re-import it into a new project, sets the whole project to whatever tempo the MIDI was. And now things don't line up anymore, and you have to figure out what the actual tempo is. So that would be the worst case. But just make sure that the time signature and the tempo information is correct, because that will likely be imported along with the MIDI.
Yeah.
And then the start and end points and all of the end points, not so much, but the starting points.
That's a great point. I could see that causing all types of havoc and not understanding why things aren't working. So totally do that.
Yeah. That's also why I always import MIDI first, because I don't want to have everything perfect and then import the MIDI and everything's messed up. So I always import MIDI first. That will typically give me the tempo map and all of that, and then I import the audio tracks.
Okay, so one thing we've said many times on this podcast is to, when you export your audio files for mixing, re-import them into a session and make sure they all line up. It's hilarious because nobody does it, and then they screw it up, and they're like, I guess now I know why. It's like, yeah, you've heard me say it, but it's fine. Everybody gets one, and but it's the same with MIDI, especially with MIDI. Re-import it in, and it should line up. You should be able to load up that same drum or whatever instrument you were using, and it should all work. If it doesn't, it's not going to work for whoever you send it to.
Honestly, that one thing here will solve like 95% of all problems when it comes to exporting and importing tracks. If everybody would just like re-import all the tracks that they've exported into a blank session and then check if it lines up and check if everything's labeled in a way that makes sense. If a stranger can look at this session then and can find their way around all the things, then it's correct. And if not, then you got work to do. And if everybody would just do that, I think that would eliminate 95% of all problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there's one thing that I'm going to charge extra for, it is MIDI mistakes, because often it's hard to know that it's a mistake even. So all of a sudden, like if my assistant has to humanize the drum performance and does all of that work, but the drums aren't even in the right place, or they're not mapped correctly, and now he's humanized kind of the wrong thing, which is not necessarily going to work once you go back to There's all this room for error that is going to take up their time and be billable to me, and it's going to result in being need this expense on this client side, right? Because they're going to have to redo it. So this is like really you want to get this right, or else it can you don't want to have, hey, we haven't even started your mix and you owe us more money. You don't want that email.
No, and you can always ask, right? If you don't know what you're doing, and when in doubt, just ask before the project, and I'm sure we're happy. Like, definitely, we both are happy to help you, and I'm sure most mixers, if they're cool people, they will just help you get it right, or they will point you to some resource, or
Totally.
they will give you some more time to figure it out, or whatever. But like, just ask when in doubt. But don't send something saying that this is the thing, and then it turns out it's wrong, and then work has been done, and it was all for naught, basically. So
Yeah, and this has also caused me to miss deadlines, which like is such a bummer. But it's like, okay, we were meant to mix it this week, but I still don't have the files because now we're starting over on the MIDI thing. So you really just want to get it right because you might miss your window, and then you got to wait.
Exactly. Now the next part, that one is interesting because I put down a note here where I said, like, for drums, consider splitting up the MIDI so that you have one MIDI file per shell, per cymbal. And Malcolm says, I'd say, like you say, you'd say do the opposite of this, basically. You only want one MIDI lane for the entire kit. There's pros and cons to both of these approaches, and I guess it just comes down to the way we use MIDI. And at the end of the day, we agreed that it doesn't really matter because, again, all that matters is that we know what's on the MIDI track. It's easy for me to split up one MIDI lane into multiple lanes if I need to, and it's easy for Malcolm to put it together on one if he needs to. Important is just that we know that a kick is a kick and a snare is a snare, basically.
Exactly.
That's really all that matters here. So yeah, I don't think we have even have to get into this. Like, you can deliver one MIDI file for the whole drum kit, or you can export each shell individually, whatever works for you, as long as at the end of the day everything lines up, it's clearly labeled, and it works on our end. So yeah, that's basically all.
Yeah. As long as we know what it is, we're good. Now the next couple notes are just us redundantly saying label everything correctly and double check that it lines up.
Yeah, exactly.
And now here's a great note though that Benny had put in that I hadn't thought about, but it's that you need to understand that your mixer might not be running your MIDI in real time. So what that means is that when we're mixing, it might not be a virtual instrument reading the MIDI, and that it might already be committed down. And in the case of Benny and I, it almost definitely will be. So my guy Stacy receives the MIDI tracks to prep my mixes, and I tell him to just send me a recorded drum kit. So he loads it into a virtual instrument. He'll humanize stuff he needs to, make sure there's no problems. He even chooses the drum kit in that case. Either I like what has been sent to me by like whatever was programmed in the first place, and I use that, or if I don't, I just tell him to choose one, and we talk a little bit about the genre. And then he sends me stems audio files that were printed from this MIDI from a virtual instrument as if it was a recorded drum kit, because that's like what I like to work with. I like to work with recorded drums. So what that means is that I don't even have the MIDI anymore. I mean, technically it's somewhere, but I haven't even loaded it into an instrument. I get sent audio files, I start mixing. So you can't expect that, hey, can we change this drum fill, on revision 2 or whatever? It's like, well, no, because there is no change in the performance. It's recorded at that point. So this really comes back to the point that when you send out your MIDI, the song needs to be finished.
Yes. And now you're probably asking yourself, why wouldn't you just run it in real time? The reason is we are actually printing samples or like sending MIDI and not printing the drum kit is like the production is not finished. You haven't decided what instruments are going to be playing on the song. Like, that's actually the recording part of the process. That is not the mixer's job. So we're happy to do it if that's what we agreed on. But actually, this is not really mixing. And if I'm mixing a song, and Malcolm is the same, I guess, then we want to focus on the mix. And we don't want to spend time choosing samples and basically doing production work and engineering the song. This has to be done before we get to mix the song. And if you didn't do it, then our assistants or our partner engineers have to do it. And the other reason is, as long as an instrument is running in real time, you get pretty random results because there's round robin samples, which means every single time you hit play, a different sample is going to be playing. So it's not very predictable. And it can be that I print a mix with a drum kit on, and then I print it again, and then one of the hits is a little bit quieter than in the first version. And I don't want that. I want consistent, predictable results. So at the end of the day, I just want to avoid errors and mistakes. And I want to have, also for archiving purposes, I just want to have a session full of audio files, and that is what I'm going to be mixing. And if you deliver MIDI, the first step is for us to choose the right sounds, print them, and then we start mixing. That's the reason for this. And most mixers we know of do that. If there is a reason for us to keep it more flexible for whatever reason, we can always talk about that. There might be a situation where it makes sense to just keep things for longer, but then we have to talk about it. If you don't say anything and our job is just to mix it, then we're going to be pretty soon in the process, we're going to be printing and committing things. So yeah, that's just something you need to understand. And we don't blame you for not knowing that, because how would you? But that's why we say that in this episode, that you just got to understand that a lot of people at home, when you are producing and recording music, you probably just have your instruments on all the time, and then you go back and change things. And so people assume that's what we do, but in the mix, it's different. Mixing is different from production. So
Yeah.
the virtual instruments are off. It's also a CPU thing. If I have my virtual drum kit running, depending on the drum kit, they can be very CPU heavy. And if I just turn them off and I print the samples, all of a sudden, like, I have twice as much CPU power available.
Yeah,
so
exactly. Yeah.
it's also a thing. You said Stacy sends you stems of the individual kit. Can we please agree that it's called tracks and not stems?
Sorry.
because I really want to say that, because that's so confusing. And I really wish that everybody in the industry would just call tracks, and stems. So
Yes.
stems are group tracks and tracks are individual tracks. So
yeah. You're entirely right. I've relapsed recently and started saying stems again for no reason. I'll work on that.
Yeah. All right, perfect. But yeah, other than that, you're totally right with everything you said. But one thing, I have one question though for you on this, Malcolm, because I was kind of surprised that you said this, that you're printing things pretty early on too. Because I remember, and I might be totally wrong, but I remember you running things in real time at some point. Or was it Trigger or something? I remember that something was like going on.
Oh, Trigger is running real time often.
Okay.
Yeah, for me. Yeah.
Okay, so that's nothing to do with audio. You're triggering with the key spikes and all.
Yeah,
that.
and at this point, I Stacy will send me the audio files of the drum kit as if it was a live recorded drum kit, but he'll also send me key spikes for my trigger tracks as well. So yeah, that process stays the same. Yeah, ultimately, if I get programmed drums for a song, my workflow is the exact same as if it was live drums.
Yes. And think about a situation where we're not talking about drums, but like synths or pianos or stuff like that. Like, how crazy is it? And people do it, but like, how crazy is it that you would send someone just a MIDI and tell them that I want, a synth sound?
Yeah.
Like what is
that
that?
can mean anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
It's clearly,
totally
the production is clearly not done if you do that. Like, how could we know? Maybe it works with a piano when it's really obvious, but even then, like, do you want an upright? Do you want a grand piano? Do you want a dry? Or do you, all these things? You have to make a decision. And if you're not sure, if you're not capable of doing it properly, in your opinion, then just provide both. Just do the best you can. Send in your reference, your scratch track, basically, and the MIDI, and then we can make a better version of what you have or use what you sent us. But and we just have to commit those things, because we can't work off of MIDI that has basically no information, and we have to choose. Somebody has to choose an instrument before we can start mixing.
Yes. Yeah, totally. There's really no reason not to be sending wet versions of all MIDI stuff. They're all quite good these days, right? And like even the stock stuff. I've mixed a song that was the stock Logic kit. That just like chose its own performance, and I was like, "This sounds great. Why wouldn't I use this? What's the point in changing it just to change it?" So, always send it wet as well, and then if the mixer wants to swap it out, they can.
Yes, and this comes down to the whole conversation where I often say to people, like, you have to put your producer hat on. You are the producer. You have to make these decisions, unless sometimes there's a situation where a band, where we agree that I'm sort of the remote producer and they want me to choose things for them, and we work on the demos together. That's a different story. But then we separate the production and the mixing process. So we work on that first before we get to the mix. It's important to understand your role, really, and to understand that producing and mixing are two different things. I can't stress that enough. And I think it's confusing these days a little bit, because so many people do everything on a laptop and they just keep working in the same session, and the sort of everything's kind of blurred. But it's still important to know these differences. And it's also important to know that I think that in the electronic music world, or hip hop and stuff, it might be a little different, where somebody makes a beat and then also mixes it, and somebody else is rapping to that or something. That's a different way of producing music than like recording something and sending it to somebody to mix it. You just can't confuse the two. So just understand that basic concept. I think that's what a lot of people really don't understand, and that's the reason for all of this. It's not that they are lazy, but it's that just they think this is how you do it basically, and they don't know the difference between producing and mixing, but there is a difference, and for good reason, because we want to be objective, and these are different parts of the process, and we want to address the song from the mixer's perspective, and we don't want to spend time making production decisions. So
Totally agree.
all right, what else? Oh yeah, different samples and instruments will not only have different mapping, they will react different to your MIDI differently. So I'm interested in how you address that, Malcolm, because I know that Thomas and I, it took us a while to get this right and to find the sweet spot and to like know which velocities work with the samples that we like and all of that. Because somebody might send a programmed drum kit and they don't really like their samples though, so they ask us to use something different, or we decide to use something different, or they haven't delivered anything at all, but they have listened to something while they were recording the song, and now we decide to use something else, and now maybe the mapping is correct, so a kick is a kick and a snare is a snare, but maybe our sampler sounds much softer than what they had, or vice versa. Maybe they had something that sounds quite soft, and then my sampler does like full-on loud hits.
Yeah, less dynamic or something.
Yeah. So it can't be the same. That's also something I think you just got to be aware of the fact that it is like that, because drum samplers and every sampler are just real recordings that are. You tell the instrument to play back that real recording when a MIDI note hits the sampler, basically. So what that means is those real recordings are obviously different. Some will be louder, some will be quieter. They use different gear. It's a different kit, different player, all of that. So a 120 velocity in your sampler will sound different than a 120 velocity in my sampler on the snare drum. So how did you address that with Stacy? How do you make sure that what Stacy does and sends you is like feels correctly and is similar to what they heard when they were producing the song?
Just by having a reference track to compare against, and then just using his ear. Like it's just like, this, send me something that sounds right. And when I have him doing that, I'm leaving up the judgment of choosing the kit as well, right? I end up choosing my own samples on top of that kind of thing, but like choosing the whole kit overall is really his decision at that point. So he's already listening for like what sounds right with this song. And if there's an issue, he's just going to have to take care of it. Maybe that means choosing a different instrument. Maybe that means adjusting the velocities globally. It's kind of like just get it done, whatever it takes.
Okay, that makes sense.
What do you do?
So yeah, basically the same. Like Thomas does this too. So he chooses the samples and he will just by ear and by taste basically do things that work for the song. But still, there's the occasional situation where the artist had a really, really, really quiet ghost note in there, and it ended up being a little louder after we've switched to a different kit or something, and that can just happen, and then it's just a matter of communication. But overall, it's like basically the same as you do. But we found it challenging to really nail it, and especially if the artist has a very clear vision of what they want, but their samples just didn't sound great or didn't match the song. So if they really like the feel of the performance, but they want different samples, it can be challenging to achieve the exact same feel with different samples. And I'm saying this because if you are using MIDI and you're mixing yourself or sending it to somebody else, but even if you're mixing yourself, if you at some point decide to switch to a different instrument, you just have to pay attention, and you might have to adjust the MIDI before you print it, and you have to pay attention to how it changes, because every sampler reacts differently, and it's just one of those concepts that you have to understand, and then you will understand why it can happen that it comes back slightly different compared to what you have delivered, just because every drum kit is different. Just like in real life, every drum kit is different, and not a lot of people are aware of that. Actually, they think you swap out the samples, but the performance stays the same, and this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. There are kits with like 5 velocity layers, and then there are kits with 25 velocity layers that are much more detailed. So there's got to be a difference.
Yeah, you're right. And I think the only time I can really think of that being like a little bit of a hang up in the revision process, we just, it was just a matter of overcoming it with automation or whatever. Yeah. There's a kind of always a way, I think, to get it to what it needs to be. But it won't be the same. You're right. It won't be the exact same.
So that's why it's totally important. When back to the whole exporting and preparation thing, it's so important to include everything in your notes and in your and the documentation that you have, that you send along with your files. Everything that's really important to you. So if there are very subtle ghost notes that are really important to you, maybe just include that in the info and just say, hey, I really like this performance, especially this and this, and then we obviously pay attention and we try to get it right, but due to the nature of MIDI and everything being so different, errors can happen. And the more you document and the better the job you do at this, the more likely we are to really nail it and get it right.
Totally.
And the same thing is true the other way around. If you're like, hey, these are supposed to be ghost notes, but I couldn't make them sound like ghost notes, let us know, and then we can find something that sounds like a ghost note.
For sure.
Cool.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's really the overview. And again, it boils down to, in time, clearly labeled, and finished. Like those things, just if you can figure out how to get us that, we're going to have no problem. And of course, if you just re-import it into your own session and double check it, that'll solve all of these problems.
Yep, totally. One final thing I want to add, just to not confuse people. All the time now, we were talking about programmed drums or programmed instruments. And we were saying that choosing the kit is actually not part of mixing. Please don't confuse that with like adding samples to a track while you mix songs. This is, these days especially, this is part of mixing and very common. But that still means we need a drum kit first, and then we might add our samples on top, like you said, Malcolm. And that's different from like programming drums from scratch. So yeah, we might add samples, and that's part of the mix, and we won't charge you extra for that if you do that. Hopefully your mix engineer doesn't. But if you just send a very basic MIDI thing and it needs a lot of work and it's like not even close to what you want in the final product, then that's not part of mixing. Those are different things, just so you're not confused. So programming drums is one thing. Adding samples to augment or replace sounds because it doesn't really fit the mix is another thing. That's
yes. The sounds kind of fall into mixing, but like the performance, like if you're wanting the beat to change or fills to change or more humanization, like really all of that should be done before it gets sent out. And if it's not, it needs to be sent out before we start mixing. It needs to be addressed and brought up before we start mixing, right? Like we already said, we're not running these things live in the mixing session. That step is already gone by the time we mix it. So depending on the mixer, they might be able to help you with that. Like I said, Stacy can humanize a drum performance. So if that needs to happen, it's not an issue. And I usually bring it up if I think it needs to, just based on hearing the ref track as well. But try and be preemptive with that. And just the parts need to be finished though. Like like the drum beats and the fills, they need to be finalized first.
Yes, agreed. All right.
Okay.
That's it for today.
Totally. I hope you enjoyed that and have fun making some music.
Totally. Thank you for listening. We appreciate you and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.